Hi, everybody. My name's Johnny, and I'm an alcoholic. And I'm glad to be here tonight, and I'm glad to be sober. Just to be sober. You know, when I said in my first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous and they talked to me about being sober, I didn't think Alcoholics Anonymous had anything to offer me. I was as physically sober when I came to my first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous as I am tonight. As physically sober. And that seemed to be my problem. If I could have stayed loaded forever, I'd have never came to Alcoholics Anonymous. But I kept getting interrupted out there on my happy road of destiny by people in those little black and white cars. And it's funny, you know, things change and alcohol, you know, it becomes almost trendy to become an alcoholic anymore, and they start new things called intervention. I want you to know that the Los Angeles County Sheriffs knew about intervention in 1940. There's nothing new about that. I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad to be sober. I'd like to thank Clancy for the privilege of participating in an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. I have always considered it some type of a privilege to be allowed to come in here and sit in meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous. I have never been able to get it through my head that I have a right to be here just because I don't drink alcohol anymore. I think it's a privilege. I think it's a privilege for people like me to be allowed to come in and spend an evening or an hour or 2 hours with you good people. Because there's nothing in my life prior to coming into Alcoholics Anonymous that would entitle me to live 1 second in the good life that I live today. But by the grace of God and a miracle called Alcoholics Anonymous, the good life is mine. A life that I never dreamed existed. And for lack of better words, I can tell you that my nightmare turned into a fantasy. And the fantasy I live today is beyond my wildest imagination. I never dreamed life could be like this. I never dreamed I could feel like this. And I never started out to become an alcoholic. I didn't want to be an alcoholic. Everybody in my family drank whiskey, made whiskey, sold whiskey, and did the things that people who make whiskey do. They were a bunch of real weird people. They gathered up on Saturday and beat each other up. They drank each other's whiskey and stole each other's women, and whoever survived was king for the week. I guess that's the way they worked their deal out. I don't know. But they confused me, these people, not by what they did, but by what they said. I was never confused by their acts of violence because I was angry and hostile and bitter and resentful all my life, it seemed like. So I can understand what it's like to put your foot into somebody's belly. It's almost like a spiritual awakening if you really God, it feels good to even think about it if you really want to know the truth. And if you're angry and bitter and violent, that's not a bad thing. And what confused me about my family more than anything else was that these same people who beat each other half to death on the weekend would gather up on Wednesdays and put their arms around one another and say, we love one another because we're family. And that confused me because I said to myself, I guess, if that's what love is, you can keep it. Because I don't ever remember uttering the word love prior to coming into the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. It was not in my vocabulary. And the reason I didn't utter the word love to any other human being who lived upon the face of this earth is because I'm a user. See, I'm a taker. I'm a taker of things, and I'm a user of people. I'm selfish, I'm self-centered, and I'm self-serving, and I got an ego bigger than the whole room. And you don't need much more than that coupled with a bad attitude to have a bad start in life. And that's the way I lived my entire lifetime. I used up everything in my life. I hear things in Alcoholics Anonymous that I don't understand sometimes. I hear people say they drink up this and they lose this. I used up everything before I came here. I'm a user. See, I'll use them up. I never said I loved anybody for a very good reason. If I told you I loved you, I gave you an edge. And I didn't give anybody edges. I kept the edge. You see, users don't love, users use. And when I was through using everybody, I just cast them aside and went on about my business. And I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to be like that. I started looking for a way out, and wherever I went, I was confused. I went to church with my grandmother when I was a child. And I never figured on one very simple little thing before I came to Alcoholics Anonymous. Wherever I went, I went. I know that's a little heavy here, but try to hang on to it because that's about as deep as I get. I don't get much heavier than that. And I took that rotten attitude and that bitterness and that hostility of mine, I took it over and set it right smack dab in my grandmother's church. And I hated everything that moved in that church. And there was nothing, because what came to me from that podium of that man's rostrum that day was that I was supposed to love and honor and respect my parents, and I didn't. I hated them. I hated them for reasons I didn't even understand, and God, I felt guilty about that. I became frightened to death sitting in that church a long time ago that people were going to find out I was hating when I was supposed to be loving, and I didn't know what to do about that either. I turned to walk outside the door of the church that day. The old man standing there drunk and hungover, and he tapped me on the head and said, "Son, if you continue to go to church, you're going to grow up to be just like me." I don't know what that did for my old man, but I haven't been back to church since. And it hadn't got anything to do with church. It's got a lot to do with me. I didn't want to be like my old man. He was a drunk, and I hated him. Thank God, because of a miracle called Alcoholics Anonymous, and because of a step in our program of recovery that says we have to make amends. When I was 12 years sober, I got to sit down with my old man and tell him I didn't hate him anymore. Had to drive halfway across the United States to find him sitting on a bar stool. And when my dad died last year, that was all taken care of. There was no more bitterness or hatefulness in there. That's what Alcoholics Anonymous has done for me. Alcoholics Anonymous has cleaned up my insides and made it bearable for me to live with all the secrets that I had before I came here. And God, I piled up a lot of hatred and bitterness and nightmares before I came to Alcoholics Anonymous. I destroyed everything I came in contact with. I said I was never going to drink. I saw what alcohol did to my people. I saw my uncles drink whiskey and go to penitentiaries. I saw my aunts drink whiskey and work on those houses on the other side of the tracks. I saw my old man drink whiskey and beat up my mother. My mother drink whiskey and beat up my old man. I saw what whiskey did. I said, I'm not going to drink. I'm not going to be like them. I'm going to be better than they are. I'm going to step out into that world, have something, and do something, and be something. But one day I took a drink. Just out of curiosity, I got into my old man's bootleg hooch and took a drink of alcohol. And what happened to me was that I sold my soul into bondage that day. Not to alcohol, but to the feeling I got when I drank alcohol. I sold myself into bondage to a feeling that took me into the gates of insanity and death and beyond for the next 20 years of my life, pursuing that illusion that I got when I drank alcohol. That feeling that went down inside of me and stilled the screaming madness, that took me from the black pit of nothingness and stood me into the gray fringes of the business of living and installed in me that arrogance and said, damn you world, it's all right. I'm not good enough to be around the good people, but I'm too good to be around the bad people. It's okay right here. And for the next 20 years of my life, that's what I did. I pursued that illusion into the gates of insanity and death and beyond. And what happened to me when I drank happened to me every time I drank. There's nothing ever different happened to me. I took a drink of alcohol. 3 days later, they pulled me out from underneath a bridge and stood me in front of a judge and sent me to the Hutchinson State Reform School. 20 years later, I took a drink of alcohol. They pulled me out of a car in Compton and stood me in front of a judge and sentenced me to 20 years in the penitentiary. That's what happened to me when I drank. I got drunk and went places. I traveled around out there, baby. I went from reform school to junior penitentiaries to nut houses. Now they call them treatment centers, but still funny farms as far as I'm concerned. Always doing the same thing. I'm sitting on a furlough from a reform school when I'm 9 or 10 years old and alcohol ain't working in my life no more. I don't know what to do about that. I'm frightened to death. My magic is still all about. It's not magic anymore, and my craziness is there, and my nightmares are all there, and a guy handed me some pills and said, try these. I don't remember saying to him, what are those? Do you think they'll bother me if I take them? Thank God they weren't X-Lax, that's all I can tell you. We're going to have a whole new 12-step program called Laxatives Anonymous working around out there. I could be standing here tonight as an adult child of a laxative taker. I would have been functional, but Mother was on the toilet all the time when I was little. I hear stuff screwier than that around here sometimes. All I can tell you, it worked. That's all I can tell you. And sitting on the same street corner on a furlough from another reform school when I'm 12 or 13 years old, I'm eating pills and drinking wine and nothing's working and a guy stuck a needle in my arm. And for the next 14 years of my life, I stuck needles in my arm, ran in and out of institutions. That's what I do. I live out in the streets. I take and I use and I abuse and I destroy everything I come in contact with. That's what I do. That's the way I live my life. With no conscious thoughts, no conscious concern for any other human being who lived upon the face of this earth except for my own well-being. What I wanted when I wanted it right now. That's the way I live my entire lifetime. And if you live like that all your lifetime, what you do, the same thing will happen to me. Pretty soon you'll end up with a string of nightmares you can't get rid of. And it happened to me. In 1951, I stood outside of a grave, handcuffed between two detectives, and watched them bury the only thing in my life I ever cared anything about my baby brother, with my words of my mother's ringing in my ears that I'd murdered my baby brother. I spent the next 4.5 years in a penitentiary. I came out there and tried to prove what a psychiatrist in San Quentin told me wasn't true. He told me people like me didn't change. He said I was doomed to die in an institution. He took me down and showed me a little green room. He says, you're going to end up here, hot shot. And I told him, not me, I'm different. I'm different. The theme song of the alcoholic. I'm different. I'll come off now that institution bound determined I had that deal beaten. 6 months later, I'm laying in a nut house kicking and screaming. When I made my round to some of the better laughing academies in the country, interviewing psychiatrists, I used to talk to them. They talked to me about my mother, and I talked to them about their mother. And it just, and what I hope and pray to God is my last interview with a psychiatrist was in a federal government hospital in Fort Worth, Texas. A little over 31 years ago. I remember that. I remember shuffling in and sitting down at this man's desk. I remember looking up against the wall and looking at his plaques and diplomas. And I was under the impression he knew something because he had plaques and diplomas hanging over his desk. I was under that impression. But he opened his mouth and he told me he didn't know any more than anybody else had ever known. He looked at me and he said, Johnny, if you didn't drink these things and swallow these things and smoke these things and shoot these things, you wouldn't have any problems. You know what they told me in the Hutchinson State Reform School when I was a kid? My counselor told me if I didn't drink, I'd be all right. When I was in juvenile hall in Los Angeles, my counselor told me if I didn't drink, I'd be all right. When I was in Whittier State Reform School, my counselor told me if I didn't drink these things and swallow these things and smoke these things and shoot these things, I'd be all right. They told me that in San Quentin. They told me wherever I went, if you didn't drink these things and swallow these things and smoke these things and shoot these things, you wouldn't have any problems. And what none of them ever took into consideration, I suppose, every time they told me that, I was as physically sober as I am right now. As physically sober. How many times I wanted to scream at them, don't you understand, for God's sake? Because they really don't. Don't you understand? Take all this madness from inside of me. I won't put that other stuff inside of me. Take these nightmares away from me. Because you see, now I got a problem that's worse than all the rest of those problems I've ever had. Now the things that I put into my system are no longer making the nightmares go away. Now I'm in trouble as long as I'm awake. I don't know what to do about that. I got on a Greyhound bus and came back to Los Angeles to kill myself. A little over 31 years ago, they tied me down in a bed in the old Los Angeles County Jail, more dead than alive. I weighed 128 pounds and I was yellow, and there was a doctor standing at the foot of my bed telling me I was going to die. His words to me were, son, you're going to die and there's nothing we can do for you. And I said, okay. All day passed and all night passed. He come wandering back into my room the next morning and he stood at my bed and he said the same thing. The third day he came into my room, I had a terror grip me that I've never known before or since. The idea came to me I was going to live and not die. I was going to get up out of that bed, go to the penitentiary, and come back out and start that rat race all over again, and God knows I didn't want to do that. I laid in that bed for 18 days and 18 nights. I didn't eat, sleep, drink, or do anything. I just laid there. And one night, because I knew nothing better to do, I screamed out the only prayer I ever said in my life. I said, oh, God, help me. I thought for a long, long time nothing had happened because there was no blinding flashes of light. Nobody come running down the hall with a dozen donuts saying, we got an AA meeting down there. I didn't get up and wander off into the tulips somewhere. I just went to sleep for a little while, and I got better and better and better. I'll tell you how sick I was. 2 short weeks later, I'm up running around the jail looking for some more of the poison to put me back on the bed I'd just gotten off of. And there's a very good reason for that. Because in the back of my mind, where my problem seemed to be centered, was the knowledge. The knowledge that once upon a time, when I could not stand life anymore, I could ingest something into my system and it became okay for an instant, right now. And see, that's all I ever wanted. I just want it off of me now. I can't stand it anymore. Get it away from me now. I can't stand it. I'm going to go crazy. So I got loaded again. And I stood in front of a Superior Court judge and was called a blood-sucking parasite in society. Man told me I didn't have any right being around decent people. Told a woman sitting in the courtroom who was carrying my child, if she cared anything at all about her child, that I'd never be allowed to see it. And you know the funny thing about that is I stood in that courtroom and heard those words saying, the man didn't say anything to me that I didn't know about me. I've always known about me. I have never been able to lie to me about me. That's why sobriety was so attainable. I couldn't stand it because I was always faced with what I was and the faces and the nightmares and the things that I had created in my life. That's why I could not stand to be sober. I know that. I had to get rid of me. It was I had to. I just had to all the time. And I remember for a long time after I got sober, I remember one night I was riding to a meeting with Chuck and I was saying to him, he was always talking about surrender. And I said to him, didn't I surrender in my deathbed, Papa? Didn't I? Please tell me I did. Didn't I surrender? Didn't I have an in-depth surrender in my deathbed the way you did? And he said, sure you did. And I said, then how come I got sober 2 weeks later? He said, that's very simple, son. You have to surrender every day. Every single day of your life you have to surrender. You see, I didn't know that. I didn't have any idea about anything like that. I didn't have anything like that when my brain exploded in that courtroom that day, and I spent the next 9 months of my life crawling around on the floor in a cell in solitary confinement, barking at the moon, drifting in and out of sanity. But on the first Sunday in November 1959, through no great efforts of my own, I wandered into a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. I didn't come to Alcoholics Anonymous to get sober. I was sober. The reason I came to my first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous was because the institution I was in let women come in there. I came to my first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous a little over 29 and a half years ago to smell perfume. And I've been honking and sniffing around her ever since. You really got to be careful what gets us sickos in here, I'll tell you that. I remember moving in and sitting down in the back row in what I'd lovingly like to call my throne of contempt. I had my coat collar up and my shades on because I was cool. If I'd have been any cooler when I got here, I'd have froze to death, for God's sakes. I remember looking up on the backboard, and I said to myself, I saw two big A's, and I said to myself, my God, I've wandered into an anti-aircraft brigade. I didn't know what Alcoholics Anonymous was. I said to this clown sitting next to me, what is this? He says, it's Alcoholics Anonymous. Well, I sunk down in my seat. Gangsters weren't supposed to be hanging out with them winos. There'd been Gangsters Anonymous or Over Hip Anonymous, or how about Dope Fiends Anonymous? Isn't that kind of macho? Makes addicts seem kind of candy-ass to me. I mean, if you're going to be bad, be bad. You know what I mean? I was crazy. I didn't know what I was. So I thought I'll wait for these women to tell their racy stories. You got to remember that when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, there weren't very many young, pretty girls in Alcoholics Anonymous. They weren't. These old gals got up to talk and said they'd drank for a long time. You could look at them and know they'd been somewhere for a long time. I mean, Jesus, that's your job. I used to drink. I said, I'll bet you did drink. Bad, too. I know. You can tell. I mean, you got the answers. You got the answers. They had the scars of alcoholism about them, these people. They wore them like badges of honor. But thank God, they also wore the armor of our program of recovery. Thank God, because they had that little thing about them, these people, who had driven 185 miles up those old back roads to come to talk to a room full of people who didn't want to listen to them. People like me who sit down in the back row and scoffed and made fun of them and mimicked them. Had all the answers for everything except how to stay sober. Here they sit with this. They were doing what Norm used to say. They were giving a little just for the hell of giving it. Just for the hell of giving it. They were out there giving just for the hell of giving it, and it showed. They talked about God that day I left Alcoholics Anonymous because God was the reason I was. It was not my fault. It just wasn't. See, I'd run out of people, places, things, circumstances, and conditions, so I still had God to blame for everything. God doesn't talk back. You can blame me for everything. You can listen to it in Alcoholics Anonymous all the time. You hear people talk about it. Guess if God wants me to have a job, he'll shoot it down here to the club. The next time you get hungry, you will lock yourself up in a closet and pray for a hot dog. If God squirts you one through the keyhole, you call me. I've been looking for a deal like that all my life. I'll tell you what I found out about God since I've been sober in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm not a spiritual giant, and I don't know a great deal about a lot of things. I do know that this program works. That's all I really know. And I do know that God will not do anything for me that I can do for myself. I do know that. There's only been one single thing in my entire life I have never been able to do. I was never able to do it before I came to Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm not able to do it right now. I won't be able to do it from this day forward. Of myself and by myself, I cannot keep from taking a drink of alcohol. I can't do that. And yet, from the first moment I laid eyes on you since November 1959 to this very instant, I haven't had a drink of alcohol or a mood-changing chemical of any nature in my system. And what blows my mind even more than that, I haven't had a conscious thought or a conscious desire to put any of that stuff in me from the first moment I saw you to this instant. And that doesn't make me wonderful. My God seems to understand that I'm so sick that I cannot harbor a thought in my head for over 30 seconds without putting it into action. And so he protects me. Of all the people in my life prior to coming into Alcoholics Anonymous who confused me, the people of Alcoholics Anonymous confused me more than anybody else when I sat in your meetings in my early days. In my early days in Alcoholics Anonymous, I sat in these meetings and you talked to me about being sober. You would get at podiums like this and you'd say, I used to drink, now I don't drink anymore and everything is wonderful. And I'd say to myself, I guess I'm not alcoholic then. I'm not drinking either and I'm crazy. I'm as physically sober as you are, Buster, and I'm crazy. I'm just crazy. There's something wrong with me. I wish I could be an alcoholic. If I could just be an alcoholic, if it just simple like that, if I could just be one. You say you got to get active. I got up and run around like a chicken with my head cut off. I picked up ashtrays, poured coffee, smiled at people. It's wonderful here. I went back there in inventory point and died. I was doing what you told me to do, and I'm crazy. And I'd say to myself very simple things like, you see, I'm not alcoholic. If I was an alcoholic, all I'd have to do is not drink and pick up these damned ashtrays, and I'd be wonderful like everybody else. But there's something far more wrong with me. And every time I talk to anybody about it, they'd say, it's in the book. And I'd say to them, what's in the book? And so it's there. I'm going to tell you what it is. What it is within the 164 pages of our program of recovery, the book Alcoholics Anonymous. What it is what I thought it was, but it really wasn't when I took my first drink. What it is, what it really wasn't, but what I thought it was when I ate my first pill. What it is what I thought it was, but it really wasn't when I had my first shot of heroin. What it is the thing that I was born without, that seemingly missing piece that made me complete and whole and give me some purpose and some reason for being. That's what's in that book, Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, from time to time I sit in meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous and I hear people from these podiums tell you and try to tell me that Alcoholics Anonymous is not enough. I'm going to tell you something. If anybody who ever tells me that, there's only one thing that goes in my mind. They have never tried Alcoholics Anonymous. They may have tried a lot of things, but they haven't tried this program of recovery, because I haven't been anywhere else, looking at anywhere else, doing anything else, or listening to anybody else, from the first moment I sit in these meetings to right now. And as I stand before you tonight, folks, I wouldn't trade places with anybody who lives upon the face of this earth. I would not trade my life with anybody. And that's the most magnificent thing that I know of, that I've been all day today and didn't want to be anybody else. I was just happy being me. And I was just as excited about going to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous tonight as I was 28 years ago tonight when I was getting ready to come out of a penitentiary. Just as excited. Well, when I walked out of the penitentiary 28 years ago, come this Sunday, the same thing didn't walk out that walked in, because I was armed with this program of recovery. Because sitting in that penitentiary one day with a man taking my fifth step, I heard myself admit to him that I was an alcoholic. I don't know where it came from way down deep inside of me, it came out of me. And it brought a freedom with me that I carry with me this very instant, because as I stand here before you tonight, I know what's wrong with me. I'm an alcoholic. I'm not an alcoholic and anything. When I was an alcoholic and something, I couldn't have your program, because I was different from you. I was either worse than you are or better than you are. And I didn't have to do what you had to do to stay sober. But you see, since I became an alcoholic, since I admitted to my innermost self that I was an alcoholic, I've had to do all the things that the alcoholics have to do to stay sober. I have to have a sponsor. I have to attend meetings on a regular basis. I have to do what I'm asked to do in Alcoholics Anonymous. Not what I want to do, but what I'm asked to do. Chuck taught me a very simple answer for a telephone. He said, Johnny, when the phone rings, your answer should be, if the date's open, it belongs to you. That takes care of Christmas, Thanksgiving, the 4th of July, and birthdays. That takes care of most anything. Because, you see, I do belong to Alcoholics Anonymous. Good, bad, or indifferent. I'm the byproduct of the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. The byproduct of it. I am not anything miraculous. Something miraculous has happened in my life. I'm not a miracle. I came out of that penitentiary on the 4th of June, 1961, to a world I didn't know anything about. And I've been out there hacking it one day at a time in a world I still don't know anything about. Doing it. The sponsor told me I had to go to work. I said, what? And he said, W-O-R-K, work. I had a sponsor who went to school for hard-hearted sponsors. I've only had 2 sponsors since I've been sober. First one I had for 22 years, and he died very suddenly. And then I had an old man who was like a father to me that I loved very much. My sponsor I didn't get to say goodbye to, but I got to say goodbye to my papa. I got to say goodbye to him real good. I sit and watched him. I sit and watched the disease ravage his body. And I got to try to put something back into his life to give to him. I got to learn a very simple thing as I sit with my papa when he was I learned that I'm not God. I learned that he wasn't God. I learned that he was a human being. And I learned that I was a human being. Because if I was God, I would have healed him. I would have put him in my arms and I would have hugged him and I would have got him walking and stood him straight up and let him walk along. but I'm not God. I learned that here in Alcoholics Anonymous. If I was God, there'd be a lot of things different. But you see, I learned I'm not God. I'm just a human being. I'm a guy who's learned a way to live that's magnificent beyond all description of any way of living that anybody has ever taught me. I lived and learned and ripped and run out there in those streets for over half of my life. And for the last half of my life, I've been hanging around in meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous doing what you've asked me to do. And about a year after my sponsor died, I went down and asked Clancy to be my sponsor. I didn't go down there to ask Clancy to be my sponsor. I went down there to ask him a hypothetical question about a hypothetical individual. Because I was sober a long time, and after all, I did have babies. And at the end of that conversation, I said to him, Clancy, you know, I need a sponsor. And I thought for sure he was going to say, what an order. I can't go through with it. And he told me something to do, and not very much. And I try to do that. And I'll keep on doing it till he tells me not to. Because I don't know anything better to do. I must be a lot sicker than a lot of people. I probably really am. I know that when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, I was very spiritually sick because alcoholism is really a spiritual malady. And the treatment for the disease of alcoholism within the confines of the first 164 pages of our Book of Recovery, that doesn't mean that I'm going to be immune from life. That doesn't mean that I'm going to be immune from people dying and from me being sick, from children on drugs, from children going crazy, from wives and divorces and business failures and people dying. That doesn't mean that at all. It just means that no matter what's happening, I'm just a human being. I'm not immune for that because I came into a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous a long time ago and sit here. I'm not one of God's chosen people. I was riding home from a meeting one night with Chuck. I remember this very specifically. I ride home from this meeting with him, and I wanted to read him this thing I'd stole off the literature table. You know how newcomers are. We always want to impress them. And so I started to read him this pamphlet about why we were chosen. He said, hold it. Don't you read me that. I said, why? We're chosen. We're special. He says, no, we're not. He said, we're God's kids, Johnny. All of us are. If I am, you are. And if you are, I am. If one of us is, we all are. If one of us isn't, we all aren't. And I said, but he said, no. He says, he made the rain to fall on the just as well as the unjust. And so I asked him a very simple question. I said, then how come I'm sober? Tell me how come I'm sober. I know people who are far better people than I'll ever be who aren't sober. How come I'm sober? He says, because you've come to understand you're one of God's children. And you've started to act like it. Now, how did I ever learn to do anything like that? I have just acted like my sponsor. That's all. My sponsor wore a coat and a tie to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. I wore a coat and a tie to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. If my sponsor went out for coffee, I went after coffee. If my sponsor worked, I worked. And you know, one day I turned around and was introduced to a complete and total stranger. I was introduced to me doing what I do. And I looked around and there was a couple monkeys doing what I did. I don't care how you cut it up. Alcoholics Anonymous just really is monkey see, monkey do. Because we don't know how. I don't know how. I can't run my life very well today any better than I could when I first got here. The first step in our program of recovery says my life is unmanageable. That means very simply my life never gets managed again. And see, I love Alcoholics Anonymous and I love its people. You know why? Because I'm better here than I am anywhere else. I'm a better person sitting with you and being with you than I am anywhere else upon the face of this earth. I am better here. And every once in a while, the most miraculous thing in my life that happens is this, that every once in a while I'm allowed to take the way I feel here with you out there on them streets and apply it to my life on a continuing basis for a period of time. Maybe it's a day sometime, maybe it's a week, maybe it's a month, maybe it's only a second. But it happened, and it never happened before I found you or you found me. That's why I love Alcoholics Anonymous, and that's why I love you people. It's the most miraculous thing that I know of. Alcoholics Anonymous in my life, it fits me very well, thank you. It relieves me from the bondage of self. Selfishness and self-centeredness sometimes eludes me. Sometimes I'm more concerned about your well-being than I am about my own. And when that happens to me, I have a good day. And when it happens over a continuing basis, I have a continuing period of time. It's miraculous. If you're new in Alcoholics Anonymous, I would only pray one thing for you. I would only pray one, that you'd find this program and find in this program that I found here. If I could this very evening give you what I have found in Alcoholics Anonymous, I would not do that, because I would not deprive you of the journey that would teach you to walk in dignity no matter what's coming down the streets, that you don't have to walk alone, that we're here and you're here and we're all together. Together we can stay sober. The most miraculous thing that happens to me is the power that's generated in this room. I love you very much. One time somebody that I was loving very much was dying, and I went to a hospital to see him. Her name was Myrtle Snyder, and she was a kindly old lady, and I sat on her bed, and she was in San Bernardino, and I drove down those old back roads crying. I didn't know what to tell her. I didn't know what to tell her at all. I just drove and cried, and I got to her bed, and she was in a deep coma. And I sat on her bed, and I held her hand, and I was crying, and I was holding her hand, and I said, Mom, I love you. I'm so grateful. What am I supposed to do? And her eyes cleared for an instant, and she looked at me, and she said, Sweetheart, there is only one way in God's world that you can ever express your gratitude in Alcoholics Anonymous. And she says, that's to remain a good example of what this program can do for you. And you know, if I had one wish, I would only hope and pray to God that I always will. Thank you.
The Pacific Group is an open meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and all members of the community are welcome to attend. The single most important aspect of AA recovery, however, is the principle of one alcoholic relating to another alcoholic. Therefore, only alcoholics actually participate in our meeting. If your primary problem is other than alcoholism, we think it would also be helpful to you to contact an anonymous organization which more specifically deals with your addiction. In any case, we hope that what you learn here may be helpful to your recovery and or understanding. My name is Harvey Andrews, and I'm an alcoholic. Welcome to the Pacific Group. Tonight's first 10-minute speaker is Jim B.
Good evening. My name is Jim Beam. I'm an alcoholic. Thank you, Clancy, for the honor and the privilege of sharing at my home group. Thank you for the structure that's in my life. Thank you for your year of leadership at this group and the structure that's in this group. I came to the Pacific Group when I was 10 years sober. I got sober up in Bakersfield, and I had a good sobriety up there. I was active in Alcoholics Anonymous. I was in the front row for most of that 10 years. When I was about 8.5 years sober, I had a good sponsor who became an Amway distributor and quit Alcoholics Anonymous. And wanted me to go with him. And he's still sober today, someplace out in the San Fernando Valley, but not doing well. Goes to meetings occasionally. And I was without a sponsor. And I've come from the sponsor school ever since I finally found this thing, wanted this thing called sobriety. I was in and out of AA for 2 years, from 69 to 71, wondering if I was an alcoholic or not understanding the big-time speakers that I heard showing up in their fine threads and telling 40-year drunkalogs and incidences after incidences in prisons and interstate flight to avoid prosecution and $40 million worth of hot checks and wives all over the country and all of this stuff. And I thought I didn't qualify for Alcoholics Anonymous because I was a sissy, and they had spilt more than I had drank, and I'd burnt the toast and come whimpering into AA. And So I kept working on my story, and when I finally surrendered, I got a sponsor, and a sponsor made me do things that I wouldn't have thought of to do. And when I found myself 8.5 years sober without a sponsor, and I looked around, and I made a list of people that I admired, or people had more sobriety than I in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I looked at each one of them and said, do I want what he's got? And the answer was always no, I don't. I don't want his program, I don't want his possessions, I don't even want his threads, you know. And I came down, I heard Clancy talk, and I came down to this group, and I was a main speaker here when I was 8.5 years sober, and it was just hideous. So somebody talked Pat Lang into signing me up without hearing me, and it was awful. God, it was awful. I came down to save you. And shortly thereafter, I asked Clancy to be my sponsor, and I went through a divorce up there, and I moved down here finally. And 10 years sober, I wound up on Harvey Ferguson's couch. He and John David and I shared an apartment in the projects, and Harvey gave me $2 in quarters every day to make sure I had lunch as I looked for work. Vince Yo told me I was doing the program backwards. I was supposed to get sober in the shape that I was in, and I had worked my way up to couch sleeping and unemployed. But then I joined this group, and as I said a moment ago, I had a good quality of sobriety. I was active in AA, and I loved AA, and I loved the traditions, and I loved the steps, and I was sponsoring a lot of guys up north. But when I hit this group, I started earning manhood. All I've ever wanted out of life is to be a responsible man. That's all I've ever wanted. To be a part of society and a part of my community and a part of whatever movement I belong to. And it was here in this group that I learned about commitments. I learned about treating AA commitments as jobs and showing up and doing those jobs even when I didn't feel like it. And when I first got here, they made me cigarette butt picker-upper out front of this meeting, and I carried the garbage out at the Saturday night meeting at the Federal Building, and I hated it. I was a big deal in Bakersfield, and I was out here with all these goofy newcomers, and they treated me like I had less time than they did because they hadn't seen me around. They figured I was new. And I learned about bonds among men. I'd never had trouble getting along with the ladies. That was easy, but I had real fear of men. And I made bonds with the guys, and I started actually having to force myself to call guys to go out to dinner before the meetings or to go to a movie after the meetings and do things with the guys and build real friends. And that ethic came out of this group. Where I came from, you didn't do that. After the meeting, you went home. Or you took some newcomer girl out and hepped her, you know, with her steps. Covered bad motives with good ones. And it was here in this group that I learned what the yard was all about, and I learned what being clean-shaven was all about, and how I began to respect myself. As I'd worked the steps by the time I got here, but I still felt like a wuss. I felt inferior. I felt unmanly. I felt perverted and twisted. But as I've been in this group for the last 8.5 years and been active, and under Clancy's split-second decisions and 2-minute conversations and hanging up on me before I was through talking and showing me how ridiculous I thought about things, I grew up. I grew up here, and I married a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous while I was in this group, and I'm faithful to that woman, and I'm active in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I go where I'm asked to, whether I want to or not. I love AA, and I love the steps, and I love my sponsor. And if you're new tonight, whether you understand what we're doing here or not is not important. It's only important that I did what they asked me to do, that I took the steps in sequence. That's why they numbered them, they told me, for dummies like me, so I take them in order. If I did those actions, if I wrote that inventory, if I read it to somebody else, if I went around and found people who forgot I'd borrowed money from them and paid it back, even when it wasn't convenient and when I didn't really have the money to give back to them, that I would feel like a man inside. At 10 years of sobriety, I still thought manhood was notches on my bedpost. I still thought manhood was making myself superior by putting other people down. I thought manhood was a set of threads and a big-time job. I thought manhood was possessions and things that I could show to people. And under you guys and your brutal honesty, and under Clancy's tutelage, I have found out that manhood is how I feel about my own actions, how I feel about what's beneath the threads, how I feel about what I did this afternoon and yesterday and the day before, how I feel about me when I put my head on my pillow at the end of the day. Manhood depends upon me asking a God that I can't see, I'll never meet in all probability, something I can't feel or touch, and totally depending upon him to direct my life. I'm a carpenter by trade today because the weather's nice and I love doing that sort of thing. Maybe in November or December I'll have to get a regular job. But today I earn my living remodeling people's houses and doing handyman repairs and building things out of wood. And I love that kind of work, and I love what I get out of that kind of work. And I can sit back and look at the finished product and say, I built that, and it'll be there for 22 years until the termites get to it, or it's my mark, or it's something I've contributed, and it's material, and I can look at it. I didn't rip somebody off selling them some sled off of some car lot and feel bad about it, you know? Because I did that. I did that for a long time. And I didn't sleep good, but I had a pocket full of money. And you guys helped me when they took away my money and when they took away my house and when they took away my car. You loaned me cars and you donated money to the Beam Foundation for Christmas and that kind of stuff. And you've made me what I am today. So if you don't like what I am, it's your fault. If you're new, stick around at these meetings. See what you become. They tell me that we're not through yet, that the steps go on forever, and I can't wait for the journey. Thank you.
Turn the tape over now, please.